Okay, well, hello, good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. This is the last event this week that GSA is hosting as part of Construction Inclusion Week. And we're happy to plan and present Day 5 community engagement for Cradle to Cradle community engagement. We're also excited for the lineup of presenters and topics that we have today. As a quick introduction, we'll be hearing from Frank Giblin, who is our director in our central office, our headquarters for the Center of Urban Development. We're also joined by David Latus, who's supervisory architect in GSA Region 9, the Pacific Rim, based in San Francisco. I am David Polk, the regional chief architect for GSA Region 2, Northeast and Caribbean, based out of New York City. And we're also joined by an external partner, Calvin Gladney, who is president and CEO of Smart Growth America, who we partnered with before and wanted to invite him as an external perspective. So again, welcome. We're really excited for this session. For those of you that have joined us have already read the session description, but what I want to point out is that we really want to dive deeper into what community engagement means and really talk about how GSA builds buildings and relationships in communities across the country, and to raise a little bit of awareness around kind of the people, programs, and policies that we have in place around these efforts. Part of the learning objectives for the continuing education credits will be, like I mentioned, understanding those policies and programs. It's also about understanding how to minimize construction impact, but maximizing the community impact. And then leveraging those community voices at the best times. And then understanding also the why, right? Like what is the sustainable and equitable development? But before we jump into the meat of the presentation, I want to pass it off to Julia DeRossi for some opening remarks.
Thank you, David, and thank you for going over those objectives. Welcome, everyone. I think it's been a really great week, both listening and learning, as well as participating in Construction Inclusion Week. For GSA specifically, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility are absolutely paramount. And as public leaders in the design, construction, and real estate space, this needs to be integrated into every part of our mission. I just want to emphasize, we have a pretty large standing with across the country as one of the largest landlords. And we not only build buildings, but we build relationships with those communities across the country, both in the built environment with the dialogue that we leave, but also in our engagement strategy. We know that federal investment matters in construction in both large and small communities, and where we construct matters and how we construct really matters. Even though community engagement is already part of our policies and procedures at GSA, we're always looking to think critically about right-sizing our tools as well as our tactics. That's why we have our Design Excellence Program, our Construction Excellence Program. It's why we have the Urban Development and the Good Neighbor Program. We value those perspectives from all of the communities that we plug into, including the industry. And inclusion is a continuum. Last year, we were really happy to reestablish our standing partnerships with ACE Mentoring, as well as NOMA, the National Organization of Minority Architects, through several memorandums of understanding. And we're really excited to expand our conversation for Construction Inclusion Week. As owners, we're interested in the long-term investments of all phases of our projects, making sure it makes sense, both in terms of project context, as well as the location. So I'm super excited to hear the great lineup of presenters that we have today to talk about cradle to cradle development, the lasting impact we can have, as well as GSA's role in the design and construction of the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as the recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. I really appreciate the time that you've given me here today. And with that, I will pass it back to David Polk.
Thanks, Julia. So what I want to do now is really set the stage before we have our presenters talk. And for especially those that are external to GSA, really understand, like, who are we? We're really the federal landlord, right? We're the broker in a sense. We provide office space to other federal agencies for them to fulfill their missions and in turn serve the public. GSA owns or leases 400 million square feet of office space. And our main market is federal office buildings, courthouses, and land ports of entry. We also have other specialty typologies like data centers or laboratories. And construction is the most aspirational and ambitious undertaking of the human race. And it's really complicated. And engaging communities takes time. Right-sizing the buildings takes time. Deciding where they're located takes time. Hiring architects, contractors, finding the right people. It's all an investment. But that's why we exist. That's what we're here to do. And part of the goal of what we're trying to talk about today is unpacking what is community engagement, right? Understanding that construction is not just a blue-collar job. A lot of construction is actually happening in white-collar admin settings, billing, bidding, payrolls, submittals, pay apps. And we really need to understand the various communities and the various engagements that we have at our disposal. One of those communities could be interagency at the federal level. It could also be from municipality to municipality, or just industry in general as we tap into our design excellence peers or construction excellence peers, as well as the obvious ones of the general public. So again, as one of the largest landlords in the country, we think as owners, we design and construct differently. We think long-term. We build buildings for 50 to 100 years, and we are stewards of the built environment and of patrimony. So today's presentation will showcase just some of the people, policies, and programs that we have to engage all of those phases. Okay. And what we're going to do today is we're going to hear from our GSA lineup to really talk about more about the what and the how. And then Calvin Gladley is going to wrap us up with the why and the importance behind the tools that we have. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it off to Frank Giblin.
Thanks, David. Next slide. So as David touched on, GSA does a lot of property development and management across the country. And he pointed out the leased inventory as being important and sometimes not seen as typically in many communities as the owned facility that people know well, the courthouse or custom house and that kind of thing. We do a lot of different types of facilities in a lot of different ways, some through leasing, some through new construction and various delivery models. And each of those things gives us different opportunities and different challenges to engage with local stakeholders. And geographically, the context also it's challenging and unique from place to place. One thing that I would note is that GSA does real estate development where there's a federal need for that development. So oftentimes we're doing work in areas that where the market is not driving development. And so that gives us a special opportunity and also I think a special responsibility to try to set the tone for that development. Next slide. So certainly there's a lot of interest in the federal government getting better at engaging with local stakeholders right now, but many folks on the line, if you've done GSA work or done other federal agency work, you know that this is not a new concept. So even since the year that GSA was founded in 1949, there was the notion in the Federal Urban Land Use Act that when federal agencies are investing in real estate, they ought to do so in a way that provides other benefits. They ought to do so in a way that tries to align with local goals as well. And there's been a number of executive orders and laws that have taken place since then, touching on everything from urban design to location of facilities to sharing the operational use of facilities as well. But it gets back to that same theme. How can you be a force multiplier? How can you get multiple returns by doing the federal real estate investment in a way that meets not only the federal need, but also local needs and interests, and also advances larger federal goals as well, whether it's sustainability or environmental justice. So some of the questions around this conversation: who has easy access to jobs and services? Who bears the cost of a federal development? And also who enjoys the benefits? Who is in the room when we make these decisions? And is the inclusion leading to influence and not just being present? And finally, how does the site, the design, the construction impact the community. And again, that should be looked at in a way that's not just to avoid the negative, but also is to accentuate the positive as well. So next slide. I'm going to quickly touch on 4 themes around this idea of engagement. There's lots of different ways to look at it and different angles and opportunities. The first I'd call out is that location matters. And we've gotten much smarter about looking at the impacts of the location decision recently. This is showing our smart location calculator. It's a tool that's available to the public if you're interested in it. It was developed primarily by EPA with assistance from GSA. And it lets us look at potential sites and existing sites from a sustainability perspective. So we can look at how are people getting to a site, how are people likely to get to the site in the future, cars, public transit, or other, and what's the greenhouse gas implications of that sort of thing. Also, who has easy access to the site via transit? What about the low-wage communities? What about minority communities? Isn't that something we also should look at so that the sharing of the benefits of jobs and services is shared across the board? And again, this is something that's available to the public. We're using it as a tool internally when we look at our projects, but we also use it in a way that helps our conversations with communities. Many communities we work with don't have ready access to these types of tools, and it helps the conversation to sit down around sites and look at some of the implications of one choice or another. Next slide, please. One dynamic that's really helpful in getting to meaningful engagement is an aligning of aspirations. So this is in downtown Omaha, Nebraska. Some years ago, the National Park Service and GSA were working on getting a new regional headquarters for the National Park Service. And you see the condition of the site and the location on the 2 leftmost slides. It was light industrial, mostly unused, largely contaminated site. And the city had a vision to turn it into a world-class waterfront. GSA and the city talked about it, and the city said, we can help assemble the site for this property, but we'd want to make sure that this new development supports our long-range vision for the waterfront, which GSA agreed to. The challenge was, how do you put those elements into a federal procurement, in this case, a lease procurement? So long story short, we did a workshop with the community, open to the public. Also, obviously included city officials and city planners and stuff, but also arts and educational entities that would bring something to the table. And what we came up with was sort of a vision that went into the procurement documents so that when the market competed on the project, they competed not just on cost per square foot or the ability to complete a project on time, but they also competed on how their proposal would advance the goals of GSA and the city together for that waterfront. So the alignment is for the National Park Service. Not only was this something that supported the city's goals for the waterfront, but it supported their interests in helping their public interpretive programs around the Lewis and Clark's Trail along that river. And so you can see the Park Service building right there front and center. It's not a rendering. This is built at the foot of a newly constructed pedestrian bridge. So it's basically the Class A position on the waterfront that supports what the city was trying to do and also supports or aligns with the federal mission. So if we can have our engagement lead to that kind of alignment, that can be very powerful. Next slide. So another way to look at it is around how is the project designed? And this is in downtown Greenville, Mississippi. We had not yet picked a site yet, but we're working with the mayor and city officials to not only pick a site, but also decide or help collaborate around how should the new site be arranged and designed. And one of the elements that we worked on with the city was how should this building relate to their ongoing and planned public events that they have there. You see in the upper right-hand corner, it's a rendering of our design building, but superimposed on an actual photograph of one of the major downtown events that's hosted in Greenville. And so they had an interest in making sure that our federal courthouse there was open and activating on all sides as much as possible, and also that it could support those future events in a seamless way, and also would relate to the retail that they were trying to get going along that main street there. The city has suffered from a lot of disinvestment over the years, so there were certain elements also included streetscape and other things that would help to set that tone. And so in this way, this plan that was developed with the city was something that our design team relied upon during the design process to get at those things. So we've also taken this idea of collaborative design and put it into our P100, our design standards, so that early in project development, we know the context we're designing to, the aspirations of local stakeholders, and again, can charge our design teams with accomplishing that, just as they're accomplishing other program elements for the project. Next slide. So there's also the concept of convening power. And if you're doing a federal real estate project, that's something that really needs to be appreciated. And I think that anyone working on a GSA project has to understand that their project is an opportunity to bring local partners together, and not to assume that the local partners have been collaborating previously. So on this large land port of entry or border station project in Arizona, we did at the feasibility stage, before design had started having a conversation, and we workshopped it with local partners, including partners from the other side of the border, both federal officials from Mexico, but also the town directly adjacent to the border, and worked through lots of nuts and bolts issues that were impacting both sides of the border, and then worked in the opportunities there that could then be incorporated into future design. And the collaboration that happened around that was so positive that it was actually recognized by a national organization, recognized the two mayors for their quality of collaboration and how that solved some of the issues there. And I can tell you too, that among the issues they were looking at is traffic that was backing up and passing through the town and basically bifurcating the town in a lot of ways. It just so happened that some of the backup was caused by how traffic signalization was working in Mexico. So it's a direct example of how these things are related. The knee bone's connected to the thigh bone and all that. And it was just a smart way to engage early, incorporate it into the feasibility study, and address these issues together. And using that convening power of a federal agency or in a federal project, that project that's actually going to happen in some ways can be more powerful than just a plan. So next and last slide. So just a few thoughts with the idea of how do we use inclusion in a way that leads to influence and also implementation. And these are some of the lessons that I've learned, and I'd want all the GSA folks on the call and anyone who aspires to work on GSA projects, I'd want them to think about this. The first is that the community is never a single voice. Sometimes the city officials you talk to may not know or may not agree with the perspectives of others, but it's a good idea, and it's our responsibility to do our legwork and make sure that all voices are heard. Silence on an issue does not equal acceptance. Just like any other decision, just like any other dynamic, community interest around a federal project might weigh in when that project becomes closer to the 11th hour. That's usual. We need to be proactive to go after those issues and not assume that silence is acceptance or that no news is good news. The other thing that we've seen on a lot of our projects, that how the project's impacts are viewed from a community perspective, a lot of times will be based on what the opportunity cost is or what the alternate development could be on that site. So luckily, GSA's project developments are not typically undesirable uses. A beautiful federal courthouse or a new and improved land port of entry is great in most communities. But the city will, the community, I should say, will view that as what they could have there instead. They might love a new courthouse, but not on the site where they're planning a city park, for example. And so we need to appreciate that and have that be part of our thinking right from the get-go. We obviously need to seek multiple returns, and this should not be just a project management risk mitigation to head out issues, but it should be a very proactive, how do we identify opportunities and not just risks, so that we can advance both of those things. Obviously, we want to encourage candor, and if you've worked on federal projects, you know that one of the dynamics is many things are pre-decisional, and then they're post-decisional. And we can't hide behind pre-decision. We have to be as open and transparent and address the tough issues as much as we can early in projects. That's good for everybody and for advancing this notion of having inclusion be something that's actually transformational. And then finally, the last comment would be that community engagement without action is just talk. We've gotten very good at different engagement techniques. We have good design teams that know how to read context and understand context and engage with community stakeholders and learn context. where I think all federal agencies still need to make some progress on how we implement those things. Do we have the systems, the processes, and the budgets in place to act upon the good ideas that we get from a community? So that's my last slide. I'm going to hand it off to David Leadis, who's going to tell you a little bit about a project where they went in depth on community engagement, and also it led to action, which is very positive. David?
Hi, thanks, Frank. I was the project sponsor for this project, and you can go to the next slide, please. So this is San Francisco. Yellow Star is our project site. Next slide. This area of the city is home to vulnerable communities facing a variety of environmental justice issues. Next slide. When the original design of this building started in 2000, the site was a dilapidated Greyhound bus terminal. And at that time, the idea of mid-market transformation in the city was fairly new. The idea is still very much alive, but the transformation is still in progress. And public spaces in this part of the city are a challenge to manage because of homeless encampment, overt drug dealing, drug use, littering, graffiti, and violent crime. For GSA, tenant satisfaction surveys we're showing that the federal employees in this building are concerned about their personal safety, just getting to and from work. Next slide. So this is an image of one of the main art pieces in the building, a James Turrell piece entitled Sky Garden. This was taken just after the building was completed in 2007. Next slide. By 2015, GSA had built this 8-foot tall fence around a part of the plaza to enclose it to create a dedicated outdoor dining area for the cafe, which is a small building there on the right of this image. And you can see the fence there as well. Next slide. And we see, again, this is around 2015, we see erosion in the decomposed granite surface of the plaza. Next slide. And you can also see how, sorry, back up one, please. You can also see how this is, how the plaza itself is relatively vacant. It's just because it's sparsely used. Next slide. And this slide is, this photo was taken around 7 p.m. on a weeknight after the building is closed down for the day. The busiest time of the day for the plaza is at night. All these sort of unsanctioned activities that I mentioned before result in a lot of litter, graffiti, discarded needles, human waste, and just damage being done to the building and to the landscape. Next slide. So on the 10-year anniversary of the building being opened, we noticed bad press, unhappy building users, unhappy neighbors. Everyone is sort of pointing their finger at this plaza. Next slide. And so we begin asking ourselves some tough questions, trying to define the problem statement. Does this design have anything to do with it, or is this just a matter of putting more effort into programming activities in the plaza? Are we simply seeing the effects of larger societal problems that are outside of our control? And if so, could changing the design really even fix anything? These are questions in our minds. Next slide. And so we consider the mission of GSA in this context. Resources are scarce for a relatively new building, but we do have the responsibility to protect the building, and we can at least acknowledge that this is an important issue for the community. Next. And so the idea for a student design competition came up as a way to get another perspective. Next slide. So at this point, at the start of this competition, we're still holding the door open for a solution that might not involve design or renovation at all. And so we're asking students to propose what we called interventions. Next slide. We used the challenge.gov website as a platform to run the competition. We announced the opportunity in blogs and social media. We put flyers up around the neighborhood. And we were able to get a buzz going in the local community through the process of finding community leaders who would be on the jury to select winning entries. We contacted dozens of organizations, including homeless advocacy organizations and cultural affinity groups in the South of Market Civic Center areas of the city. Next slide. We had 4 winners out of over 80 entries, so a good turnout. And this entry is about planting a community garden, which could produce food that might be served in a cafe, while also providing an educational exhibit and experiential learning opportunity for the building's childcare center. Next. Another proposal is to literally listen to the community and record those sounds to generate these waveforms that are built into the surface of the plaza. It's kind of an interesting idea in thinking about community engagement. Next slide. But all these are renovation projects, renovation proposals. Next slide. And having done the competition, it really built a lot of excitement around the idea of renovating the plaza and making an investment. The students showed that there was a lot of interest and a lot of opportunities. And so then this led to an appetite to make an investment. But the question still remains, what do we design? Next slide. And so the need for community design charrette to figure that out was very clear. If what's happening in the plaza is a symptom of societal problems, and perhaps the solution could likewise be found through community engagement. Next, we brought Smith Group on board to facilitate the charrette. We organized the charrette with a feedback loop where GSA presents information to the public via a workshop. We record people's feedback, and we use that feedback to refine the information and the design ideas. Next slide. So we held these open house style workshops in the cafe, in the plaza itself. Leading up to it, again, we put ads in the paper, put out flyers, notified our network of community leaders from the student design competition, and we ran a social media campaign. We tried to reach the widest audience possible just to enable participation by as many people as we could, especially people who are local to this part of the city. And here's an example of two of the activity boards that were put up in the first workshop, which are designed to be these hands-on interactive activities. Next slide. And so here's what the resulting data looks like after the workshop results were sort of processed. And you can already see some consensus starting to emerge. And just to give you an idea, we had over 100 attendees attend, so it was a pretty good turnout. Next slide. Based on that information, Smith Group generated several conceptual ideas like this one. Next slide. And this one as well. Each one of these themes, or each one of these ideas has its own sort of thematic program, just to elicit feedback from the community. Next slide. Here's some boards from the second workshop. Again, we're giving people the opportunity to indicate a preference and provide some other feedback. Next slide. And so when you tabulate the scores, the grow and the trade concepts are the clear winners. Much like the first workshop, we had over 100 attendees. A lot of people at the workshop expressed their gratitude to GSA for doing this, for making the effort, and to listening. We had attendees from all walks of life who had a lot of diverse perspectives, and yet in the end, strong consensus emerged. Next. So with that information, GSA developed a design build program of requirements, which was a blend of the two of the elements from the two themes that I just showed. With that, we began a design build acquisition for an 8A set aside to disadvantaged businesses. GSA selected Ironwood Commercial Builders, which is a woman-owned small business in the Bay Area, to do the job. And in this, in the context of inclusion, women represent only about 10% of the construction industry workforce in the US. So the 8A program is really just another way that GSA and the federal government can be inclusive. Next slide. So the contractor teamed up with landscape architect Hargraves Jones, who presented these images as case studies. Next slide. This image shows how the landscape design concept of a folded plane drew inspiration from the building itself. Next slide. And here's a site plan. Next slide. So it's designed to accommodate a typical pop-up tent that you might see in a farmer's market. And this is the first project in Region 9 to be site certified, which is a third-party certification system similar to LEED, but for landscape design. The design exceeds stormwater requirements in the city, provides pollinator habitat through the selection of low maintenance, drought tolerant plant species, among other sustainable design strategies. Next slide. After bringing the design builder on board, our intention was always to hold a third and final public meeting to present the actual design shown here to the public and to show them how their feedback translated directly into the final design. Next slide. By that time, though, COVID was in full swing, and so we opted to have a live webcast with Hargraves Jones to present the idea. And I do acknowledge that online presentation limits attendance to those who have access to a device, but given the situation, it was just the best we could do. That said, we did have a large online turnout. Next slide. And next slide, please. So construction took about 18 months. This is some finished photo of the place. The plaza was reopened to the public in January 2022, earlier this year. Next slide. A really important thing that came out of the outreach effort and the community engagement was GSA's awareness of a local nonprofit called Demonstration Gardens. They help people who are new to or returning to the workforce by teaching them soft skills that are needed in the workplace. And they do that by tending community gardens and have successfully transformed hotspots all over San Francisco. So when they approached us through the public workshops, we felt that they had the potential to help be stewards of the new plaza while also serving the community, especially those who need help. So we've entered into a license agreement with Demonstration Gardens that allows them to use the plaza for their activities. And we were able to design the plaza for Demonstration Gardens and provide them with a shed for their gardening tools and make some other design decisions that enable their work to succeed here. The success of the plaza isn't just about renovation work, it's about what the space means ultimately for the community long after the construction concludes. And next slide. I just want to conclude by saying that the original building, when it was completed in 2007, it really became an icon of green building, especially for the federal government. Green building design is inherently inclusive because everyone is a stakeholder in the environment. But choosing to invest in sustainable development in places like this, where environmental disadvantages are affecting the most vulnerable people in our society, helps fix more than just the environment. And so with that, I'll turn it over to David Polk again, who will talk about some projects that he's been working on the other side of the country.
Thanks, David. I'm going to go through quickly kind of two topics. One is an NJIT studio that we partnered with, and then some other projects that we've started for the bipartisan infrastructure law. So, it's really not uncommon for GSA to partner with academia. It's one of the ways that we recruit and expose students to public service. It's also a way to promote and embed in our practices diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And it's not just based purely on race or ethnicity. What I found out by being part of this process was, it's a real local project with real local solutions that we're searching for, and it's less hypothetical, less academic. In the first review, I had this joyful out-of-body experience when I realized that a lot of these students were users and designers. Most of them were vaguely familiar with the federal campus that we have in Newark, New Jersey, because of the underlying civic presence. But others had been to the building with their families to get government services, including citizenship and naturalization, Social Security benefits. They were using the public services through these public buildings. As a quick highlight, this kind of quasi-federal campus is 3 buildings. It's a courthouse, a large post office, and a large federal building, which constitute just under 1 million square feet on 6 acres. And the reality is the space between the buildings is not always the best. And we've kind of done patchwork. We've maintained as much as we can, but we know on the horizon, we need to do a little bit more. We need to be a little bit more bold in how we're treating that area. So the students jumped right in, okay? They started analyzing and they started researching various scales, even beyond the property line of the neighborhood, to understand the context. And we discussed that time and again. the struggle and balance between not having control beyond the property line, but having a real impact beyond the property line. And there is a difference. You know, federal buildings are not subject to local zoning or building codes, yet we try to default and play with the local zoning or whatever is most restrictive, because we do want to be good neighbors. And the students here, they build a model, they projected on top of it their analysis, their observations and opportunities. They also created a framework based on those opportunities. That framework was also a way that they could measure and present to GSA senior leadership how successful those proposals were. And those proposals were varied. And a lot of them actually not applicable to a GSA bureaucratic context, but that's okay. Like, it still makes us think, and it gives us a fresh perspective on what do people think, or what do they propose for public space. I do want to showcase these two a little bit closer in, just because, you know, this was a rigorous studio semester where they did look at, you know, the tectonics of the plan or the section, the materiality, the durability. But they also looked, you know, on the right at the quality. What is the experience of the space? How is it actually going to be improved by those that are going to be using it? You know, and while we initially engaged with NJIT, we have since engaged more formally with the city and the planning department to kind of plan some improvements and get funding in line. And we're currently translating that academic effort into, you know, our fiscal years and funding methods and delivery methods to really bring this to life. I'm going to now pivot to the bipartisan infrastructure legislation. For those that don't know, this is a $3.4 billion program across 26 project locations as part of the infrastructure bill. Okay, but part of the question is it 26 or is it 52? Because there's also a corresponding community and economy on the other side of the border. So one of the other events as part of Construction Inclusion Week this morning that I attended was capital projects as economic engines. And these land ports are just that. In New York, we have two upstate, Rouse's Point and Trout River. And scale matters, even though that these are kind of small capital projects for us, they're huge and historic for these villages, for the township. Some of them are really born out of a hamlet of sorts. One of those examples was actually with our art and architecture program. Because these were so small, it really didn't fit into our capital project policy. So we did have a minimum for the program or funding for the policy to kick in. We didn't have to do our art and architecture program in Trout River, but I really have to give credit to our regional fine arts officer on my staff who said, nope, we're going to do it anyway, even if it's small, right? So she found a creative way to combine what would have been the potential funds under one artist, one contract, and still provide public art at a public building in this remote area, and to not leave it out, right? To not leave out a community or not provide that little bit of extra value. The other thing I want to mention is, you know, as we started to engage with the community and have a kickoff, is we really dove into who the stakeholders were. Because not all stakeholders need to be involved in everything, always, all the time, forever. We really need to know who needs to be involved in what phases. And we had that conversation, candidly, with the local municipality. You know, there were business owners there, local coffee shop owner. And we wanted to talk about how community engagement is not just a newsletter or just a public meeting. What's also interesting is with these specific stakeholders, Rouse's Point is one of 3 rail crossings between the US and Canada. So Rouse's Point also has a specific stakeholder of the passengers and Amtrak that cross as they enter the US from Montreal. Trout River is also a land port that we're pushing for historic reuse of the building to keep the history of the local community and what that building means to the community, how it faces the community. What I also want to emphasize is, for Rouse's Point, these are real photos that were taken over the last couple of weeks, last probably 6 weeks, where we've met in person, online, and on site. And it really is about the right tool for the right task. It's not always recreating the wheel. Innovation oftentimes is just shuffling the tools for the tasks. We need to know who benefits and who doesn't. And sometimes, we dig into requirements and codes, but sometimes we need to dig into the ground or dig into the phone book to figure out what is it that we really need to be doing. One last thing that I want to mention is these buildings, like I mentioned, will be historic investments. They will be likely the most secure, most sustainable, most resilient facility in these townships. And that's a wonderful thing. And we see the community as a steward, we see the environment as a steward, and we're pushing access as a priority. Like we've already told Amtrak, we're providing you the most accessible platform at level with the train, and we'll have to figure that out together, but that's where we're starting. The other thing is, as a sustainable facility, if we are net zero, or let's say net positive, can the local utility take the power, or are we causing a problem for them with the extra power? And those are the little types of things that we have to think through for the municipality and for the neighbors. So with that, I'm going to hand this off to Calvin Gladney to talk more about the why we're doing these things.
Thanks, David, and thanks as well to everybody who is in attendance today, and thanks to David and Frank, both Davids and Frank, for giving me such a great backdrop to talk about equitable community engagement, but in the context of the why. And I'm actually going to I'll probably use 3 frameworks to give you an answer to why do equitable community engagement. And frankly, as you heard both from both Davids and Frank, lots of ideas as to the why, but also wanted to give you a couple other ways to think about it as you are engaging in the work and are thinking about how to implement community engagement. Next slide. The first framework I'll give you is in the context of 2 stories. And if I was in person, I'd ask anybody to raise their hand. Do you know where this phrase comes from? Build it and they will come. It comes from a movie, obviously Field of Dreams. And the idea that once you build it, people will say, oh, we will definitely come to it. We know it's ours and we will use it. And I'm here today, and this is part of a framing on why to do equitable community engagement, is this phrase is just not true. Sometimes you will build it and they will not come. And I'll give you 2 real life examples to share with you why. Next slide. This is a picture of the Johns Hopkins Medical Campus in what is the East Baltimore neighborhood of the great city of Baltimore in Maryland. Maybe some of you live or know of this section of Baltimore. And Johns Hopkins Medical Campus is a big medical campus. About 19,000 people are there on a daily basis. And as you can see, it has very large scale institutional buildings, which sometimes are akin to what could be built by a federal builder such as GSA, although these are older buildings, so they don't have some of the great design that you've seen earlier. And this medical campus is pretty porous. Most of these buildings are public access buildings. You can walk through and go to almost all of these buildings. Some of the retail and other benefits in the buildings are just open to the public. And there's streets that basically crisscross all of this, which you'll call a kind of urban campus. In the context of this particular project, as you can see the little bit of green space right there, we were working with a private developer. There was sort of a biotech campus building being built right next to here. But the green part that you see there was open space that ultimately was being transformed or intended to be transformed into a brand new park. And this park being sort of in between kind of a row house set of neighborhoods in East Baltimore and the Johns Hopkins kind of more institutional medical campus. And the idea was, let's do some engagement to understand what would community residents and folks that are in this area think about what should be at the park, and the like. And so we were brought in as a team to say how to do this engagement. And one of the first things we said was, and this relates to something that David Polk said earlier, that you need the right tools at the right time. And I think Frank made a mention of this as well, which is you want to be innovative. You don't want to just do the same old engagement over and over. So one of the things, so we did two things that were unique here. The first is we did what I'll call a mobile engagement lab. And the idea is, as opposed to doing your community engagement in a school basement or rec center on a Tuesday evening, why don't you actually go to the site where you're actually thinking about doing some building and bringing the engagement there. So as opposed to showing a PowerPoint picture of the site, you can actually point to the site and do the engagement right there. And so that was one example of just a unique way of doing engagement. And the second example here was we did what's called a cognitive mapping exercise. And the idea there is, as opposed to doing engagement, which forces people to articulate in front of a group and verbalize their thoughts and feelings and desires, you allow them to draw what they feel about the area, what they see there, and what they think. And you can gauge through analysis things they think about the sort of opportunities in the area and what they think about the site in a way that you might not get if you force people to only verbalize that or do a speaking kind of role in front of people. And so during this cognitive mapping exercise, one of the things that came out of analysis of a group of people that we let draw their thoughts of this area in the Johns Hopkins campus was everything they drew showed that they didn't feel like the Johns Hopkins Medical Campus was something that they could go on at all. You could see the picture here that the buildings are very big, but as people drew these buildings, they were even 10 times larger. You would think they were Manhattan skyscrapers, the way that people drew these buildings. And they drew fencing and security barriers and the like, all of which actually don't exist. And what really came out of this, and we did a sort of narrative discussion afterwards, was one thing they saw about this campus and one thing they were worried about in terms of this park site was that it wouldn't be for them. That everything they knew about Johns Hopkins and the medical campus was it was not for them, it was not intended to be for them, and they couldn't even actually go on there. Some of them said, even though they lived down the block, they had never even walked down the street next to these buildings because they knew that it wasn't for them. And turns out from many factual bases, that just wasn't true. So it was perception. And let me go to the next slide to give you a contrasting example. And so this is a beautiful picture of Howard University. This is kind of their main building and their main yard. And Howard University is a private university. It is not a public university in any stretch of the imagination. And it does have fences and barriers because you should be doing Howard University business if you're on the campus or going to school there. Contrast, Howard University is within what's called the Shaw neighborhood of Washington, D.C. And it was a rapidly gentrifying area surrounding the campus. And basically, the people that moved into the area were much more wealthy. And Howard University is historically Black university, mainly African American. And the people moving into the area were disproportionately at the time higher income folks and mostly white. And there was a whole newspaper story about this campus and this particular yard, because what started to happen over a couple of years, were the new residents of the Shaw neighborhood, principally white, principally higher income and white collar, were starting to use the Howard University private yard as their own public park space. They were doing picnics there, they were walking their dog on the yard, they were sunbathing on the yard, and no one had told them that they could do that. And the fences that were there and the gates that were there weren't dissuading them that this wasn't a private campus. They just believed that this was for them and it was for their use. And so you can contrast those two examples of the perception of different people about whether something is for them, and how you can have people have access to facilities, and you can build things, and people will have totally different perceptions on whether it's for them or not. Next slide, please. The moral of this story, and this is a visual of the park that was built there, was a couple of things. One is, one reason to do equitable community engagement and make sure you're bringing out a variety of folks is so that you can talk to them about what you're building, not just to make sure that you get input and maybe design it differently, but also because so you can use that engagement process to remind them and tell them affirmatively that what you're building, they can get a benefit from. And if you don't, and you can use the engagement process to do that, and those two contrasting examples give you real examples of how using the engagement process in an inclusive way actually allows you to talk to stakeholders and think about their perceptions and whether what you can do differently to design something that will be clear that it is actually for their use and that they can benefit from it. Another quick story that came out of here was, what should be the name of the new park? And what came up in this conversation, in this engagement, was, please don't give this park a name, because if you give it a name that isn't just a name of one of the streets, we will feel like you are renaming our neighborhood. And unfortunately, what happened was that process of naming the park happened before the engagement, and there was a big controversy and sort of pickets and the like that really came out the fact that nobody had asked the neighborhood, should they even name the park? And so this gives me, and we'll go to the next, just a couple of learnings that come from, and you can put all three, click 3 times here. One is, if you do engagement differently and you do it in an equitable way, which includes maybe going to the site, doing it at different times and doing different types of engagement, you can get input from folks that are not the usual suspects that show up to engagement, and they can often give you information that you might not have. For example, the perception issues that might be lurking that there's no way you would know just from doing a normal design charrette process. You can avoid inadvertent mistakes like naming a park that would then create controversy in the neighborhood and the like. And also you can actually get ideas from the community that might make you do some design changes or building changes that create greater community benefit. And there's no way to sort of get that from a dashboard, but actually talking to members over time, you can do that. And in this case, one of the things that changed was who were going to be, what was going to be the type of retail in the park space changed based on community input as to what kind of retail should be there. Next slide. Quick example here, we worked with GSA to create a site selection tool, somewhat similar to the smart location calculator that Frank talked about earlier. And one of the key takeaways here, and I'll go to the, and looking at this slide, was you have to use quantitative tools and know that they give you data, but they don't give you answers as to what you should build and what you should design. And very quickly, go into the next slide. So we built this tool to think about fiscal impacts, infrastructure costs, thinking about transit access of different sites and the like, and also to think about what would be the variety of community benefits. And so we built the tool, and then we went with GSA and Renaissance Planning Group we teamed with, and actually went to Baton Rouge to apply it. And one of the things we learned in real time was a lot of the data and information that we received from the site selection tool really didn't give us a good idea of what the community and stakeholders thought about the site. And ultimately, one of the things we learned from the engagement was that the answers, the data and information that came from the quantitative tool were categorically different from the qualitative information we got from being on the ground and doing multiple types of engagement. So another real reason to do equitable community engagement is the data and information you might get from quantitative analysis and tools and the like may not, and Frank talked about this, align with the aspirations of the stakeholders and community. So you really need to do equitable community engagement to make sure you have that alignment, or at least understand where they might be misaligned. Quick and final thought here on why equitable engagement gets to why Smart Growth America believes in it so much. Next slide. I was struck by David mentioning, thinking about the mission of GSA in the context of why to do engagement and how to do it. And this is our kind of North Star mission statement, where we're trying to get to a place where, folks are healthier, more prosperous, and more resilient. And if you think about those as outcomes, then you really want to use equitable community engagement, because you can't get to those outcomes without really understanding from a subjective standpoint what the community thinks. Next slide. And you can click through on these as well. So we're inspired to do equitable community engagement because if you think about it, if you're saying, hey, how do we build and design a GSA building in a community with a diverse set of stakeholders in a way that will actually generate community benefits? That question of what will benefit the community is a real subjective one, and what will benefit different stakeholders might vary. So for example, when you listen to David's example in New York State, the commuter stakeholders for that site will be different from the folks that work in that building or community members that might live there. And so if you're thinking about, well, how do I get to outcomes that derive community benefit, you really need engagement to get those subjective answers. And so that's my presentation. I wanted to sort of end there and really just thinking overall, if you want to do equitable community engagement, you want to think about why you're doing it. And then as David talked about, and Frank as well, both Davids, you want to use different tools to actually get to different types of stakeholders. And you want to use the engagement that works in that particular locality and geography, not just cookie cutter. Thank you.
Thanks, Calvin. I want to turn it over to Chuck Hardy to do our closing remarks, our GSA Chief Architect.
Thank you, David. And wow, thanks to all. This has really been a great session to close out the week. A lot of takeaways for me, hopefully for you all too. Last speaker was great as well. They're SGA, we're GSA, same initials, same purpose, different names, kind of speaks to the week. We've heard and we're shown a lot of new ways, not only emphasize the how we do things, but also the why we're focusing on community engagement, which I thought was kind of cool. And I hope you're going to remember these things, but also share them with colleagues, clients, communities. These strategies, engagements, as you've seen, do work. They really do. We're not just kind of picking out the two best we had and showing it or whatever. This is some really good practices that we do want to start spreading the word on some case studies that show you how to do it, but also looking for others to figure out even more and better ways. As stewards of the built environment, I mean, GSA, we're always seen as that responsible party. This is a responsibility, not an option. So when we're embarking on large programs like the courthouse program, land ports of entry program, we get funds like bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act funds. We got to do, spend those effectively and meaningfully. So we need to look at community engagement as much more than just checking a box. We need to tap into the emerging and diverse voices if we want to be inclusive and better future. It was great to participate in Construction Inclusion Week and showcase what we're doing, where we're headed. Thanks to from GSA, from Ashley and David Polk and Julia DeRossi, who pulled all this together for us and made it go as smoothly as it did this week and today and day 5. Community engagement. I could have picked a better topic to bookend the week. So it's great to end on this. And so again, thank you for all for participating in Construction Inclusion Week, where GSA highlighted some of these topics each day and to bring awareness to it. Commitment and accountability, belonging, superior or supplier diversity, workplace culture, community engagement, all those kind of things. We just heard there's many ways to innovate, be more inclusive. We shared some of them, but there's a lot yet to be developed. That's kind of what we're challenging you all with. And whoever you are, wherever you sit in your organization, your community, I couldn't encourage you more to maintain a bias toward action and do something that matters. And impact is really what you do with the hand you're dealt. Some folks play cards, others build art and inspire others. So I'm hoping we're building things that inspire others. So thanks for joining, and definitely thanks you all for your leadership. Have a great one. Thanks. Bye.